Hey everybody, today I am going to be reviewing I'm Thinking of Ending Things. This was written and directed by Charlie Kaufman. I reviewed Being John Malkovich, which Charlie Kaufman wrote last week, so I will spare you the Kaufman introduction, and if you want to hear more about why he resonates with me, I would say watch that review. But I really just kind of want to jump right into this one, because this one, in my opinion, is far more dense and ambitious than Being John Malkovich. Kaufman is a person who seems to be kind of a head case. He's a person that really loves in his art to explore the human psyche and how we perceive and interpret and distort every little thing that happens in our lives. It could be anything you feel, a person going to the grocery store or a person murdering someone. It's about how we experience these thoughts inside that lead to our motivations. There's always just this coil of mental angst that's kind of keeping us entangled. And if it weren't for the senses, if we couldn't see, if we couldn't taste, if we couldn't smell, what is the world truly like? A film like Being John Malkovich is more kind of a black comedy, a satire, kind of looking at art and how we perceive it through society and especially through celebrity culture. But it's also exploring a lot of very deep things. It's exploring mortality and, just existentialism in very, very unique ways, but in a way that feels much more accessible and palatable than films he made later on. I think Kaufman has just this little thread and he's kind of been tugging at it ever so slightly, so that more kind of accessible structure and that more safe place he's used to is just kind of unraveling, and he's really pushing himself more into abstract places and becoming less and less literal. By the time he made Synecdoche, New York in 2008, I believe, that was his directorial debut, and I thought he had really pushed into boundaries I didn't expect in terms of ambition, in terms of more like metatextual context. Just the willingness to explore yourself, the mind as a writer, as a creative person, in such a dark and unyielding way, to me is really extraordinary. I think that's an extraordinary piece of work. But here he's doing something a little bit different. He's not working off something that is completely his creation. He is working from a novel and he's adapting. So he can't completely destruct the narrative so that it becomes kind of like this architectural construct, the way he did in Synecdoche, New York, which reminds me very much of like Fellini's 8.5. He's trying to remain true to the spirit and the intent while also infusing a lot of his philosophy and his point of view within that new framework. The perspective seems to come from inward within the story rather than having a more kind of objective perspective, deconstructing things more externally. From the opening shot, I felt like I really got a sense of what this movie was going to be. It's just like shots of wallpaper in a house where much of the action is going to take place. And it did instantly remind me of something like The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a very psychological story about somebody kind of losing their grips with reality. And the wallpaper is sort of that template, that Rorschach test for her. And that's what I feel about this entire film. It is a Rorschach test. It is a psychological maze that will constantly fluctuate and it will morph within the viewer's minds depending on who's watching it, where you are in your life, how you're feeling in that moment. Stylistically, it's very Kaufman. It's got, a lot of those dark, murky colors and certainly a strangeness that feels kind of like a twinge. It's like you can't quite put your finger on it, but it's enough to keep you on your toes the entire time. Even in the midst of this kind of coil of angst that he is wreathing around these characters, there is a firm intent and a firm kind of suspenseful quality to it. And the movie feels almost like a broken record or a tape that is wound up wrong, where things are kind of skipping or repeating and things might seem a little muffled or distorted at times. You feel trapped and like you're going in circles over and over, quite literally even in this film, to the point of madness. It's nightmarish, kind of the surrealism and the psychological unease is just scratching at the surface constantly like a splinter. And having this on a literal level, not necessarily metaphorical, but just on a basic, plot synopsis literal level, the story being about a young lady and her boyfriend going to meet the parents on a road trip, to me is kind of the perfect story, the perfect vehicle for showcasing that kind of, that sense of psychological unease. The ideas of emotions and thoughts and how they change our actions, because romance, of course, naturally when you're close with somebody like that, things are gonna get more distorted, more than they normally would be. And oftentimes that connection makes it hard for you to differentiate yourself and your own identity from that other person. It makes happy moments maybe more happy than they might normally seem, but also difficult moments are more difficult than they would normally seem. And it just feels like more is at stake. The way it captures immediacy in this film is just so amazing, so intricate, so detailed. Every single shot has thought behind it. The way he lets moments linger and how every kind of sensory thing that is felt is there, just beat for beat for beat. You're occupying the head of one character, or maybe two, or sometimes all at once. And of course, the key being how our emotions manipulate and distort everything. And the movie's asking a lot of questions, but one of the big ones that I found really interesting is just, who are we from moment to moment? Are we the same person that we were 60 seconds ago? If you said something an hour ago, and then an hour later it's brought back up to you and you go, wait, did I say that? I didn't mean to say that. We are constantly changing, and I think more than anybody truly realizes, and it's all in the minutia, how each moment is so full of so many ideas that can branch in so many different directions. And the film just feels like that. It feels like this big, beautiful tree, like a great oak or something in a forest, where all the roots are intertwined together and they're very complex, but yet the core of it is extremely strong. And it is a very simple story where you can really project your own psychology and your own ideas on it. On time, whether or not you believe that consciousness continues to exist after your death, or whether or not there are even truly things like original thought. Do we ever have an original thought? Or is it all recycled memories and quotes from books you've read and things that people have said to you? Everything you experience is coloring the way you are living in this immediate moment. Kaufman loves to mess with our perceptions of time. This movie is not an isolated incident here. He does it, constantly. And clearly something that really preoccupies his thoughts or keeps him up at night or whatever is the idea of mortality and aging. So he really takes the time to explore what it means to get older, which is something that you really don't see very often, and as they say in the film, because being young is so glamorized. So he really wants you to kind of marinate in what it feels like to start to lose everything, like the feeling of all of your memories all together up in your mind, but they're just slowly dissolving. And then it gets to a point when you're so old that even just basic concepts in your mind begin to wither. And eventually it's going to be all gone and you're not going to remember anything. And that's part of what's so scary about mortality and kind of trumping the ego is like, were my memories and all of that really that important to begin with? There is a lot asked of these actors in terms of every single line has to be interpreted in a certain way. And it is so, so, so detailed, I think, in terms of the choreography. I can only imagine that they must have done a lot of rehearsal. But there's not one weak link here. The performances here are wonderful. Each person inhabits their character so well so that even when it is bending in different directions, it still feels very much like their specific character, their individual character, no matter the perspective. And the performances are really theatrical when they need to be, especially when Kaufman is drawing upon like fragments of cinematic moments that, enhance this reality. But it also feels quite real, and it's going for kind of an authentic sort of thing when it needs to be. And as a viewer, I'm constantly aware, of course, of how I'm being manipulated, even when a moment seems pure in this film. The more theatrical aspects are represented through kind of very interesting sequences, but in particular, ones that I found to be most interesting were the musical sequences, which do remind you of those old Gene Kelly sequences that you might have seen in like the 1950s. An American in Paris, and of course, Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals are brought up a lot, specifically Oklahoma. But it's more like we're watching Oklahoma if it were like in the Club Silencio from David Lynch's Mulholland Drive. And even just the shot of the woman in Mulholland Drive with the blue wig, whispering Silencio at the end, it is quite similar to how we see Toni Collette as like Aunt Eller in the background. But what is cinematic here is very intentional and very crucial to understanding the meaning of the film for me. And, just talking about how film manipulation and it can be toxic in our entertainment. It's something that I've talked about a lot on this channel that I think is just unfortunately rarely explored, because many, including myself at times, have fallen for that sort of romanticism. And after a while, it starts to color the way that you view how the world should be, for better or worse. Those ideas when it comes to kind of just typical kind of glossy entertainment, something that's easily digestible, like A Beautiful Mind or a Robert Zemeckis film, they throw some major shade at both of those. And how we can use those too often as templates for how we believe real life should be, I think it can create your own unhappiness. We pretend our lives are more idyllic or we're beautiful like the celebrities in these movies or whatever, because it makes our lives more interesting, but it is also kind of avoiding a certain truth. And I really enjoy in this movie the more kind of very consciously millennial hipster nature of a lot of the conversations. They're just really funny. And I'm specifically talking about the protagonist in this story, like the girlfriend and Jake, the boyfriend, and how they're having all these conversations on this road trip. And they're talking about David Foster Wallace, and there's an amazingly clever reference to Pauline Kael, which I'm sure you can all understand is a scene that I I identified with. But I think why that works and why it's kind of funny and interesting that they're quoting all these long passages, whether it's a poem or something that was written by David Foster Wallace, it's the idea that drawing upon these quotes from others kind of helps us make it feel like we thought of them, because it helps us to feel more intellectual or whatever. It can be part of our superiority complex, our need to feed the ego. And perhaps in the case of her in this moment, it's a way for her to justify that this person isn't as smart as me. I don't really want to be with this person. But again, it's all through ego manipulation. And in this, his masculinity, his intelligence feels threatened because he doesn't really have a good counter argument, and so he just starts resorting to cliches, and he gets so upset, and he's just like, every cloud has a silver lining and it's always darkest just before the dawn. It's hilarious. It's exaggerated, verging on farce. I mean, you could even go so far as to say it is kind of farcical, but to me it's always fluctuating. It's fluctuating in a place where genre doesn't really exist. You think it's heading in one direction, but then it completely subverts those expectations. And that's part of what it's doing. It's making you conscious of, oh, you see how you've been taught to experience a movie, and no, we're not going to give you that. We're going to explore deeper. And I think to Kaufman, genre doesn't really exist. And the self maybe does not exist in whatever form, which I think makes this kind of the perfect book for him to adapt. It comes to fruition in the third act, I think, when you see the metaphor for the school itself, which you could almost look at as like a version of David Lynch's Club Silencio in Mulholland Drive. A place where, in a sense, the curtain is lifted and the illusion is sort of exposed. And I love that it's in a school, because school is kind of trippy that way, because it's like, you're a teacher there, you're part of the faculty, and you get older and older while everybody around you, all the kids stay the same age. Like one group moves on and graduates, the next one comes in. It's like time is frozen. So it feels like this very weird void-like construct for the protagonist, whoever you think the protagonist may actually be. But it's here where the protagonist is maybe self-actualizing, kind of exploring maybe the feminine aspects of themselves and the masculine aspects of themselves merging together, to finally step away from something with a perspective after all this kind of Freudian maternal and paternal and romantic partnership emblems have all blended together, to the point where they've ceased to be individual. This movie to me is about trying to self-actualize, but done in this just extraordinary, dizzying pastiche of movie, pop culture references and cliches and thoughts, and all for what? When perhaps there is no self, perhaps there is no protagonist, but in the end of the movie, you have a very lonely and painful blend of fantasy and reality that is heartbreaking to me. A man singing the antagonist's soliloquy, I guess you could say, from Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma, which is interesting. Normally you'd think he'd be singing the hero song, but it's almost as if it's like mortality here is the villain in his eyes, and perhaps guilt and regret play into that too. Whatever feelings you want to attach to this concept here, we see a life that is a mix of romanticism, pain, loneliness, beauty, truth, everything that one experiences in a life, whether or not it is true or not. We are a collection of anxieties, of philosophical musings and rambling, but only through our specific senses and through our kind of sense memory. And yet through it all, it's our own loneliness that we're trying to avoid. That is the painful thing that very few people really can grasp. Accepting that you're going to get older, accepting that loneliness is imminent. And I feel like so few people can express it to this level with this type of perspective, this type of insight. He allows us to be emotionally affected by the manipulation, as movies tend to do. Then he makes us very aware of how we're being manipulated by him, so that way we can be moved all over again, but just in a different way, where we are aware of the manipulation, so that you're truly transcending as a viewer, if that makes any sense at all. This movie is killer. It is so good. I loved it so much. I have anticipated it for a very long time because it is Kaufman, and he did not disappoint. He surpassed all of my expectations. I think it might be, I'd have to go back and watch, but I think that it might be his most fully realized and most consistent work. He took a novel that has a twist at the end, which is, it's fine for what it is, but it is ultimately a device, a gimmick, and it kind of narrows the scope of things. but he completely opened it up to explore so many aspects of existence. And that is truly extraordinary. I've seen it 3 times already. You've got to see it. And that is my review. Thank you all so much for watching. If you look here, you will see all of my Patreon supporters. The link to support is below. All my social media information is below that. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you'd like. Catch you next time.